Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to my vlog. Last Wednesday, 5 people were brutally murdered and 3 people badly wounded in what looks to be like a jihadist terrorist attack in my hometown of Kongsberg in Norway. These heinous crimes happened just a few hundred meters away from where I'm recording this video, just a few hundred meters away from my office. And I want to offer some reflections. And part of my motivation for doing this is because I see that so many of my fellow Norwegians are crying out for more psychiatry, that we need more psychiatry in the future to prevent terrorist attacks. And so many seem to assume that the solution to this is more psychiatry, and that if only he had gotten more treatment or more follow-up by psychiatry and the health authorities, then things would likely have been better. I'm going to make a case that more psychiatry would in all likelihood in the future make things even worse. More psychiatry will probably contribute to more terrorist attacks. More psychiatry will probably contribute to a more violent society. And overall, psychiatry does way more harm than good. This may sound crazy to you. It may sound as if these statements in of themselves probably qualify for a psychiatric diagnosis and psychiatric treatment. But I hope you'll stay the course and listen to the arguments that I offer so that you can do your own research on the topic. So let's have a look at this. It's really important to understand that psychiatry is really not about medicine. It's really not about curing disease. There's as little science behind psychiatric diagnosis as there is behind homeopathy. Psychiatry, to a large extent, functions as a means of state-based or government-based social control. It really is a political tool. And let me illustrate this for you. Back in 2011, we had a Norwegian mass murderer by the name of Anders Breivik who gunned down, what was it, 77 people, I think, both in Oslo and also at a place called Utøya, where he gunned down a bunch of kids. Now, if you look at how now Breivik wanted to hurt the Norwegian Labour Party because he claims that they are responsible for the mess that we are currently in with heavy immigration from the Muslim world. So he wanted to hurt the Labour Party. Now, if you look at how psychiatry and the state and the media responded after that terrorist attack versus this terrorist attack, you'll get an appreciation of just how political it was. So, psychiatrists first deemed Breivik unfit to stand trial. That's essentially insane. Now, in Norway, this was a completely socially and politically unacceptable position. So another set of psychiatrists was put in to do a second evaluation, and as ordered, these psychiatrists find him fit to stand trial, and he was, of course, convicted. Now, why was this so? Here's something important to realize. The first team who deemed him unfit to stand trial, and the second team of psychiatrists who deemed him fit to stand trial, There's no medical tests involved in making that assessment. There's no science involved. There's no scientific findings. There's no hypothesis which can then be falsified. It's a matter of essentially the psychiatrists talking to him and making inferences and mind reading what they think it's like to be him, and mind reading what state of mind they think he was in as he did those heinous acts, and then mind reading what they think that says about what he might be likely to do in the future. That's what they're doing. It has nothing to do with medicine or science. There's no science behind it. Same goes with the second team who found him fit to stand trial. There was no test that suddenly determined that, wait a minute, this guy is actually fit to stand trial after all. It's a completely subjective assessment. Now, this was really important to do politically here in Norway because people wanted to hold him accountable for his actions. And the Norwegian Labour Party and most of the political left and the media and many of the intellectuals have strongly pushed for that we need to get to the root of the ideas behind Breivik's acts, the culture behind them, the deep assumptions. They have not so indirectly blamed Norwegian conservative political parties for having to take their share of the responsibility for the acts, and that they have to mobilize against the extreme right. Many well-known critics of Islam have been tainted and more than implied as being responsible for providing the ideological framework behind Breivik's acts, even though none of these people have ever encouraged violence. Not one of them ever. Now, fast forward to this particular terrorist attack. We could, this guy has claimed to be a Muslim. He has publicized videos on YouTube stating that he's a Muslim, that he's a messenger, and that he comes with a warning that it's essentially time is up. Several of his friends have contacted Norwegian authorities because they've been concerned that he's become radicalized. And if you look at what he did, it clearly looks like a terrorist attack because he just went around with a bow and an arrow shooting people, and then he took into people's homes and slaughtered them with likely swords and knives. Really brutal, really heinous. Now, according to Rita Katz, who's an American researcher on terrorism, jihadist groups have encouraged the use of bow and arrow, and ISIS, for example, in their magazine Inspire, have encouraged jihadists to break into people's homes and slaughter them as a cheap and effective form of terrorism. So given all these indicators, there's quite a bit here to support the notion that this was a terrorist attack. Now, he does seem extremely psychologically disturbed. In the one video I have seen, his speech is kind of incoherent. He would probably get the diagnosis of a paranoid schizophrenic. He probably has that diagnosis. You could say of both Breivik and this guy, Anders, no, not Anders, Espen Andersen Bråten, that they're crazy in a sense. Crazy in the sense of being dysfunctional, committing heinous acts, and having kind of thinking that doesn't work too well to live a life of flourishing. But notice how The media, the politicians are responding in Norway at the moment. It's all about whitewashing Islam and concluding that he's insane, that this is a psychiatric case, that this has nothing at all to do with Islam. Everyone agreed that Breivik was crazy, right? Everyone agrees that this guy's crazy. But what you won't see here is our politicians, our current prime minister, going out and saying, look, we really need to look at the ideological framework behind these attacks. We really have to look at Islam as an ideology and combat it. You're not gonna hear him say that we need to confront the imams in terms of what they actually teach and their message. It's an extreme hypocritical double standard. This is where psychiatry comes in as a tool for government-based or state-based social control. Psychiatrists get to invent diagnosis and to define who's insane, who's sane, what sets of ideas constitutes an illness, and what set of ideas constitutes not illness, right? And that turns it into an extremely potent tool of power for the powers that be politically. And you want to ask yourself if you want to live in such a society, if you want to give the state such powers. Aside from that, when people scream about psychiatry being a solution and that we need more psychiatry and that psychiatry has failed, this guy has been in and out of psychiatry his entire adult life. He's been forcibly entered into psychiatry. It's guaranteed that he's been given dangerous brain drugs over the years. Now, has it ever occurred to you, whether you look at the Columbine shootings or various school shootings, many terrorist attacks, that virtually strong percentage of these people have already been in psychiatry and gotten psychiatric brain drugs? What makes you automatically think that psychiatry is a solution or that this warrants more psychiatry? Could it be that the drugs themselves have a large part in these heinous acts? Could it be that psychiatry itself is a toxic contributor in all likelihood to these sorts of acts happening to begin with? Well, here are some of the facts. Psychiatric drugs are strongly associated with violence. People who take these drugs are way more likely to commit violent crimes many times over than people who use all sorts of other medications. If you look at cases where people suddenly go nuts, like they behave completely out of character, they do heinous stuff, almost always they have changed their doses on their medication or just started on some psychiatric drug. I highly recommend the book Medication Madness by Dr. Peter Breggin, if you want to look into this. In that book, he documents 50 cases that he has been involved in the court system. And these are cases where you suddenly have a 12-year-old kid who gets put on ADHD drugs and suddenly has enormous compulsive urges to kill or stab his little sister. The 11-year-old kid who gets put on antidepressants and then 2 days later hangs himself and has never shown any inclination towards those sorts of things to begin with. They're just horrendous stories. So psychiatric drugs are dangerous, and they are connected with a risk of more violence, more suicide, more antisocial behavior, shrinkage of the brain. So for those of you who are interested in this particular Kongsberg massacre, you really want to look, what drugs was he on? What was his drug history? Had he recently been introduced to a new drug, for example? And there's also, very often too, when young people seem to live a okay life, they have some struggles. They go into psychiatry, and suddenly there's like an enormous change in them for the worse. Yeah, they could have experienced something traumatic, but very often it's right after being introduced to psychiatric drugs. There's also another excellent book by Peter Breggin called Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry that I highly recommend that you check out. Outside of terrorism, if you look at our society now in general, we have more depressed people, more anxious people, more suicides, more people cutting themselves now than I think we ever have had in like recorded history. There's an epidemic of so-called mental illness regarding young people in recent years. Now, never have so many people been in therapy. Never has psychology and psychiatry had a stronger influence on our culture. If you look at the fact that people seem to be way more depressed, suicide rates are up, way more anxious now than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago, when there was way less psychiatry and psychology and fewer people went to therapy. What makes it so obvious that more of this is necessarily the solution? It's really worth contemplating. If you look at psychiatry too, you'll see that psychiatry itself is an ideology that's essentially an assault on liberty, individual liberty, and personal responsibility. The whole ideology is rooted in violence, force. It's hard to see how that ideology is going to be the base for a more peaceful society. We seem to already have very ambivalent relationships towards violence to begin with. One thing that I see these days in the media a lot regarding the Kongsberg massacre is how people talk about senseless violence and meaningless violence. But if you ever spend time working with people who have engaged in violent acts, or if you've ever done them yourself, you know that violence is extremely seldom meaningless. It's meaningful. Violent acts are extremely meaningful for the person who engages in them. They're often motivated from a state of despair, of not having any other solution, where violence becomes the way to set a boundary or to solve something, or it might be an instrumental tool to just get what you want, or it might be a tool used in self-defense. But violence is extremely meaningful. And if you want to understand violence, you have to look at the meaning, what it meant to that particular individual to commit those acts. Psychiatry largely moves in the opposite direction by saying, look, it's just a disease. It's just a chemical imbalance in the brain. It's senseless. It's meaningless. And that robs us from the opportunity of really exploring and really having really having a discussion of these things. It's interesting too to look at our relationship to violence as a society. I watched a TV show not long ago about this British SAS soldier called Ant Middleton, who was interviewed by Fredrik Skavlan, who's a Norwegian TV host. And he talked about how he had killed a lot of people while on military duty in Afghanistan, and how he had no problems with it whatsoever. No pangs of conscience, nothing at all. Now, we deem people like this as heroes. Like if you kill on order of the state, you get medals. It means medals. If you do the same thing as a civilian, it means murder. It means disease. It means a malfunctioning brain. Now, it's one thing to protect yourself and your family if someone invades your country, and to sign up for the army. But if you look at a lot of soldiers who perhaps didn't have the best backgrounds, they join the forces, they get paid, they get excitement, they get the camaraderie, they might even be excited about the killings and feel a rush, a bit like Ant Middleton, while doing them. And that means medals, that means something good, because it's state-sanctioned killings or violence. But if someone has similar internal experiences, different motivations, but they're kind of internally sanctioned, then we interpret it very, very differently. Notice currently how we're not supposed to talk about Islam, for example, at all when it comes to these acts. This is where psychiatry comes in, because as soon as we can put everything in the insanity bucket, then we can completely whitewash Islam. Our current Prime Minister and our former Prime Minister both talked a lot about the importance of combating extremism. But this is a trap of sorts, because extremism in and of itself is not inherently a problem. Most of us are extremists, and when I say extremists or radicals going to the root of something, or extreme as in holding a position without nuance or compromise, or without really contextualizing much, most of us are extremists when it comes to an adult not having sex with a child, or not killing except for in self-defense, or not raping. We have no issues with this form of extremism. We would deem those who wanted a more moderate position on these topics to be morally misguided. Back in the day, before slavery was abolished, you had extremists on both sides. One side wanted the right to own slaves, the other one wanted to abolish it. We didn't go for a moderate solution where you had slavery on Tuesdays and Saturdays. One set of extremists won. None of us deem this to be problematic. The extremism really is... the emphasis on extremism is a way of saying that, look, what you believe doesn't matter, but it does. It really does. Unless you can... Clearly, we're talking about Islamic extremism. But our Prime Minister has his own form of extremism where he just blatantly refuses to ever mention the word and just talks about extremism in general. But he will talk about right-wing extremists and right-wing terrorism because that fits his narrative politically. So he's very willing to challenge that, but not when it comes to the Islamic stuff. Let's see here. What else did I have? So, yeah, well, so people have this idea that psychiatrists will protect us somehow. But look at the track record of psychiatry. Look at its history of lobotomies, electroshock therapy, even done currently. Um, look at the way they have treated their patients over the years. It's just a horrible history. Look at how corrupt psychiatry is as a field. Its heavy ties with pharmaceutical industries. How we're drugging kids for non-existing diseases. This whole industry of psychiatry is morally and ethically bankrupt. If you doubt that, read a book like Under the Influence by the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Robert Whitaker, who really takes the whole industry to task, right? This is as bad as calling the Catholic Church ethical after the way they have hidden and covered over sexual abuse by priests by decades. Like this is not good stuff. Furthermore, psychiatrists don't have any special abilities to predict danger, like who's going to kill, who's going to reoffend. Is this person an offender or someone who just seems like an offender? What are they going to do in the future? They're not any better than average Joe in the street to make these sorts of assessments. But they're very willing in forensic psychiatry to take the stand and to pretend that they have these abilities, even though the research shows very clearly that they don't. What are these people going to protect us from? It's an interesting thing to look at. Now, of course, you do have dangerous people in society. You have a lot of wacky, eccentric people. Most of them don't hurt anyone. Most psychiatric patients don't hurt anyone. And even the World Health Organization admits that third world countries do way better in dealing with people with schizophrenia than we do. They more emphasize family connections and things in the community, whereas drugging people like we do. This idea that psychiatry is there to protect us against ourselves, well, first of all, psychiatrists themselves are among the professions who have the highest suicide rates. Psychiatrists kill themselves more than most other professions. That's an irony. They often top the list. Poets usually top the list, but they're always high up there. That's one thing to consider. B, there's no evidence that these preventing suicide programs that psychiatry runs work, or that they can pretend who's going to kill themselves. They can't. And then you come back to the whole notion of who owns your life. If you have self-ownership, as an adult, you have to have the right to voluntarily end your life, right? But notice, we don't take people who weigh 300 kilos and who look like Jabba the Hutt and who are abusing their bodies with food and alcohol and cigarettes. We don't lock these people up into psychiatric care. We don't take the person who's a person who has a legitimate disease. Let's say that you have cancer and the surgeon said, look, you really need this surgery, otherwise you'll probably die within 3 months. You still have the choice to say, no, I decline the surgery and to go home and die. The surgeon is restricted to trying to use persuasion to get you to change your mind. He's not going to send the medical team home to you and kidnap you and put you on the operating table. But psychiatrists can essentially kidnap you and force you into treatment. Now, if treatment is forced, it's not treatment, it's torture. If you're in a place of treatment and you can't leave, you're forced to be there, you're not at a hospital, you're in a prison for all parts and purposes. So, a big problem with psychiatry is that it's able to sidestep the usual rule of law, the usual human rights. If you look at the faith of many whistleblowers over the years who get sent into psychiatry and dealt with. So what I fear is that we will get an even more authoritarian psychiatry again, because the public will demand that the psychiatrists must protect us and therefore have virtually unlimited powers to do whatever they want to do. This is a bit like the whole climate change crisis thing, that as soon as you deem something as a crisis and you're desperate for a solution, there's no limitation to what powers people are willing to grant these all-knowing, wise bureaucrats and politicians in an effort to protect them. And this is highly problematic. There's also the issue of stigmatization, that you never hear about the diabetes suffering murderer, or the cancer suffering rapist. But you will hear about the schizophrenic killer or the bipolar killer, So these psychiatric diagnoses are tools. They're labels for stigmatization and social control. Now, it's really important to understand that all these diagnoses in psychiatry are metaphorical. They're metaphorical diagnoses. So there's a difference between an actual heart disease, for example, where medical testing has confirmed that there's something wrong with your heart, versus someone saying, I have a broken heart. My wife left me. I'm suffering immensely. Is the person suffering? Yes. Is it worth doing what you can to support the person and so on and so forth? Yes. But broken heart in this context is a metaphor. It's a metaphorical diagnosis, unless medical tests actually show that there is something physically wrong with the heart. So all of these diagnoses are metaphorical diagnoses. They're voted in by consensus. Now, we can all agree that Breivik was nuts, and that this particular guy, Espen Bråten, is also nuts. But psychiatry doesn't contribute anything outside of that deepens our understanding in terms of what to do with this or what's going on. It's a metaphorical. It's a set of metaphorical diagnoses. And be careful, because if you want to make an equivalence between violence or killing and a disease, what about the Second World War, where millions of Jews were slaughtered essentially in these German concentration camps? Was Adolf Eichmann sick in a medical sense? Were all the guards at Auschwitz sick? Were all the politicians sick? Or if you look at what the communists did in Soviet Russia, what they're doing presently in China against their Muslim population and also against their own population. Or if you look at Rwanda in 1994, where almost 1 million people were slaughtered with machetes. I mean, we could all metaphorically call this sick and say that these are heinous behaviors and crazy ways of thinking. But were these people sick in a medical sense? Is there something to cure medically? Here's another point to consider. Psychiatric drugs don't do what you think they do. They don't cure anything. They chemically alter your state. Now, let's be fair. Some people prefer the alterations in state that the drugs provide, at least on a short term. But the fact that you may prefer your new altered state based upon the drug doesn't mean that it cured a previous state. It just means that you prefer this particular state, right? So psychiatric drugs do not cure diseases. And the meta-studies are in, which shows that no psychiatric drug over time has been proven to be better than not using drugs to begin with. Like, none of them. And they're all associated with side benefits. For example, about 20% of the people who use antidepressants for more than 5 years develops something called tardive dyskinesia, which is a pretty horrible thing to suffer with. People who use neuroleptics have a way shorter lifespan, for example, than people who don't. So there's a lot of stuff to look at there. These sorts of one factor is just the ideology of Islam itself. I mean, if you go back 40 years in Scandinavia or Europe, you know, these sorts of attacks just were not happening. So we really need to look at what constitutes a healthy life. I'll tell you a little secret from seeing clients professionally for the last 24 years. When people are unhappy over time, when people are unhappy and they're unable to kind of fulfill their perceived needs, right? Most people will begin to develop symptoms. Some people might begin to develop chronic pain. Other people might depress. Some people might have panic attacks. Some people might have migraines. Some people might begin to hallucinate. And if you look at a life well lived, you know, it seems like it comes down to being able to live a life you perceive as meaningful, and to have good social relationships and good relationships, and to have a functional epistemology or philosophy to guide you through life. Psychiatry doesn't offer any of this. Psychiatry is toxic as an ideology in that it sells metaphorical illnesses as literal illnesses. It sells dangerous brain drugs to chemically alter people's states under the guise that it corrects a chemical imbalance. It promotes violence and coercion, and it promotes a victim role. It promotes a victim role, that you can't help it, that you're a victim. And if you want a society that's violent, that's devoid of compassion, encourage victimhood, encouraged an ideology where people learn to medicalize the challenges of life, and to look at themselves as victims, and to look at society and other people as oppressors. Combine that with an entitlement mindset, and you have something really toxic going on. So I hope this video was provocative for you, that it might inspire you to check out some of the sources I mentioned. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them where you found this video. If you want to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.